to Perpetually Exasperated, the podcast where we've chosen to read new, best-selling books from both sides of the political spectrum, so you don't have to, and tell you how at times they've got the right idea, but mostly how they're missing the point of why everything kinda sucks. I'm Joseph.
And I'm Joseph's roiling discontent. In this next episode, we're going to be reviewing Defectors, The Rise of the Latino Far Right and What It Means for America by Paola Ramos, described by Penguin Random House as an exploration of how race, identity, and political trauma have influenced the rise in far-right sentiment among Latinos and how this group can shape American politics.
Oh, thank God it's another palate cleanser. So, let's see how this keeps us perpetually exasperated, and why you should be as well.
All right, I got to admit, this was a tough one for me.
You too, huh? Don't get me wrong, it was an outstanding book, illuminating in ways that made me think, yeah, of course, this makes sense. Why did I assume otherwise? But at the end, it left me with the feeling of going, oh, fuck, we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, me too. Because honestly, for possibly the first time, I think I may actually viscerally understand the MAGA animosity towards immigrants.
I'm assuming by that you mean you've finally seen it presented less as a political talking point and more as a deep dive into the mindset that would require that animosity, and realizing how ingrained and problematic it all is? Yeah, I feel that too.
Yeah, precisely.
And now, before we go further, we need to do a bit of house cleaning here. Something needs to be emphasized from Chapter 1, Border Vigilantes, in Part 1, Tribalism. We hear all the time from Republicans and folks who want to be tough on immigration that the border is dangerous, that immigrants are dangerous, especially illegal immigrants, and we need to have a strong border for a safe country, etc., and so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. In fact, this is the primary motivation for the, as of July 15th in the year of our Lord 2025, ongoing nationwide ICE raids to pick up and deport illegal immigrants, legal immigrants, migrants, occasionally legal citizens, etc. This is all for our safety, they say. Never mind the many, many problems we have with how ICE conducts these raids. We can get into that later. Regardless, I want to quote from the following passage, following a tirade from Anthony Aguero, border vigilante and co-founder of Border Network News, who was being interviewed by Ramos. Quote, "The data does not support Anthony's criminalization of the migrant community. Though there is undoubtedly an ongoing humanitarian crisis unfolding at the U.S.-Mexico border, a product of both parties' failed immigration policies, the Texas Department of Public Safety's own records show that undocumented immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans. And, despite the Republican Party's attempts to link migrants with child sex trafficking and a fentanyl crisis, those claims are unsubstantiated. According to UNICEF, most U.S. domestic trafficking victims are, in fact, U.S. citizens rather than undocumented immigrants. And, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, the majority of fentanyl that is crossing the southern border is being smuggled through official ports of entry by U.S. citizens.
No way!
Not by asylum seekers. Unfortunately, alarmism can at times override the truth. The more we're told to look across the border, the easier it is to ignore the darkness within us." Unquote. To borrow a phrase from MAGA, facts don't care about your feelings. No group is a monolith, but based on official government data, both domestic and international, migrants and immigrants are by far nowhere near the largest source of crime, be it misdemeanors or felonies, trafficking, be it drugs or children. Instead, the ones who are responsible tend to be citizens, and I've got a suspicion the majority of those citizens are white. Too long didn't read, the brown people aren't the problem. And yet, the truly disturbing thing to me is that not only do the MAGA gringos not care, this is a problem shared amongst more and more Latino voters as well. And the source of the problem is complicated, to say the least. We love complicated problems here, don't we?
Uh-huh.
So in Chapter 2, Don Quixote's Fantasy, during that period of time where Confederate statues throughout the country, most especially in the South, another statue came under fire in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the statue found support from a very unlikely group of people, Hispanics. To set the stage, let me give some background on the statue of one conquistador, Juan de Oñate. Quote, many might see a murderer and feel pain and rage. Juan de Oñate was notoriously violent. Born around 1550 in Zacatecas, Mexico, the city his father founded as part of the Spanish Kingdom's expedition to New Spain, Oñate led hundreds of Spanish colonialists and Franciscan priests in 1598 to what is now known as New Mexico. He is said to have ordered the massacre of 800 Acoma people and amputated the right foot of at least 24 captive Acoma warriors, a gruesome warning to anyone considering active resistance against colonization. Oñate did this despite Spain's government issuing the royal orders for new discoveries in 1573, seeking to reduce the violence of conquistadors toward natives. The king wanted to expand his influence in the so-called New World by instilling Catholicism in the hearts and minds of native people. His belief was that such a strategy would be more effective than the use of brute force. In practice, the new approach was no less violent. Natives had no option but to convert. Religion was forced on them. Their food, resources, and land were taken away from them, and their culture was suppressed. But Oñate couldn't reconcile himself with a slightly restrained version of conquest. The Spanish kingdom eventually ordered him to leave New Mexico, as his continued brutality put him in violation of the 1573 mandate. Scholars have documented these atrocities, and oral history, passed down over generations, ensures that the trauma of these events is remembered by indigenous and native peoples to this day. Unquote. So let that simmer for a second. This is a guy who the Spanish crown, not necessarily a humanitarian group of folks, thought was a psychotic piece of shit.
Yeah, they liked Columbus and didn't like this guy. That should tell you how bad this guy is.
This guy was a terrible person. This guy was a maniac. He was clearly effective at his job, but holy shit. And yet, despite that, quote, so, what makes some Latinos view Juan de Oñate in such a positive light? What makes some align with the Confederacy and conquistador monuments instead of recognizing the pain these same figures inflicted in the past? The answer to that question has less to do with what Latinos see in those statues and more to do with the way Latinos see themselves in the world. As I learned from Anthony Aguero, the first-generation American turned border vigilante from Chapter 1, there's often a discrepancy between perception and reality. That gap is an inherent part of the Latino story. Dr. Frank Perez, a scholar from the University of Texas at El Paso, has a plausible explanation for it. His research examines the impact of what is known as fantasy heritage, which refers to the historical whitewashing of our origin stories and our ability to mistake these fantasies as fact. Quote, fantasy heritage is the way we built up myths to create this very romanticized, very Eurocentric framing of U.S. history, Perez explained. The problem with that is not only how it plays fast and loose with historical data, but how it almost always frames everything as being the actions of white people that are the ones that matter. Unquote. Now, this does feel a little bit weird, right? Yet, there's a reason given by Ramos through Dr. Perez, and I think it makes a little bit of sense, unfortunately. Quote, the white man on a horse was the winner, while the darker natives were the losers. The white man on the horse was noble and smart, while the natives and the dark people were dangerous and backward. The white man on the horse got to stand tall, while the natives and the dark people had to kneel. Given that we, too, could claim to be Spaniards, it was easier to believe in the fantasy than to confront our own ancestors' complicity in the crime. Humans, as Dr. Perez explained, have an instinct to associate themselves with the ultimate winners and heroes of the day. That's a reality for people of all backgrounds. Yet, I, Ramos, believe that, as Latinos, we have a particular predisposition to fantasize and romanticize the past because our complicated relationship with colonialism has not only distorted our perceptions of good and evil, but it has also allowed us to view ourselves as both the victors and the oppressed, as both the colonizers and the colonized. Both the beauty and the curse of our history as Latinos lie in the way our race and ethnicities are deeply mixed and intertwined. This complex history of intermarriage and procreation drives some Latinos to claim their Europeanness and whiteness while also shielding them from the weight of their own racism. Unquote. Is it right? No, of course not. But there's a very real logic behind this desire to associate with figures who were, for centuries, perceived of as winners. For God's sake, how long have most white folk, myself included, lionized Christopher Columbus? Even Ramos herself idolized him as a child, and that was partly because she identified with being Spanish, even though Columbus was Genoese in Italy, but never mind that, not important, doesn't matter. And it's especially unique for Latino communities who, as said, can be both colonizers and the colonized.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I recognize that it's likely a huge minority of Latino voters and probably a smaller minority than that of the general population, but I imagine my gut reaction to the notion of something like a Latino white supremacist or a Latino Christian nationalist is similar to how those groups feel about people like Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta.
Well, that's a rather potent hatred. Why is that?
Honestly, because, I'm ethnically mixed race, and in general, I realize, or rather recognize, the U.S. as the first even partially pluralistic world power. So I've learned a deep, abiding hatred of anyone who espouses white supremacy, especially those who do so in an attempt to garner favor from the powerful, because I'm partly Caucasian, and therefore I feel entitled to input on white culture.
Yeah.
So it's a strange, very foreign, and honestly quite uncomfortable feeling to have that hatred inspired by people who are not, in the classical American sense, white.
Yeah, that does make sense. And initially going into this book, I just could not comprehend the idea of non-white people embracing, wholeheartedly in fact, white supremacy. It just doesn't make logical sense. But there was a quote from that first chapter that made me reconsider that very logic. Quote, the political scientist Benjamin R. Knoll began sounding the alarm on this issue in the early 2000s. Knoll, who at the time was a grad student at the University of Iowa, remembers a woman scoffing at the notion that Latinos could be nativists as he presented an early version of his dissertation to a room of intellectuals at a political science conference in Chicago. In his final study, which was published in 2012, Knoll concluded that as Latinos continue to grow up in and assimilate into the country, their pro-immigration bias would slowly dissipate, perhaps eventually disappear altogether. Very similar to what Heinmuller and Hopkins found, Knoll concluded that cultural assimilation, the degree to which Latinos are and feel Americanized, was a much stronger predictor of nativism than their concern about economic competition or any other variable. Yet, as opposed to many white Americans, Latinos have to work twice as hard to not just feel American, but to be accepted as American by the larger society. Assimilation is a contractual agreement. It can only work if both parties agree to the terms. Thus, recent immigrants don't just threaten Latinos' own sense of belonging, they threaten to taint the image the rest of America has of Latinos. That image is in fact delicate. Xenophobia runs so deep it can subdue even this nation's deepest source of hate, anti-blackness, unquote. So, at least in part, this I see as kind of a calculation by at least some of these people to be accepted by their community. A reassurance to the white community that they are not outsiders, not others, and therefore they will be protected from that very same discrimination that's hurled at the immigrants and or black people. Remember that last bit there. Anti-blackness. These Latino communities are all too aware of it and know very well not to be seen as black lest they run afoul of that hatred. What's the old saying? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. When in Gringo land, do as...
Be racist!
Yeah, basically.
No, you're correct. That's 100% an accurate depiction of what's going on there.
Yeah, and there is another quote in the introduction that was very vivid to me, and it helped in part explain this thinking. First, a little bit of background to this whole thing. Quote, 33-year-old Mauricio Garcia made his way to the Allen Premium Outlets just 30 minutes outside of Dallas. Immediately after stationing his car in the parking lot, Garcia got out and started walking toward people with his AR-15 in hand. From across the parking lot, Beatriz Leon, a Guatemalan woman, and her sister heard Garcia yelling and then start firing at people, seemingly indiscriminately. Panicked, Beatriz quietly got inside her car, grateful that she had left her 3 young daughters at home. Garcia murdered 8 people and wounded 7 before he was eventually shot and killed by a police officer. After the carnage, Beatriz and her sister were safely escorted from the crime scene. Digging into Garcia's background in the aftermath of his death, the Texas Department of Public Safety quickly learned that he was a neo-Nazi sympathizer and self-described full-blown white supremacist. He had left behind a long trail of social media posts and handwritten notes that painted a picture of a young brown man tormented by his identity, attempting to reconcile his Latino background with his white supremacist ideals. According to the Anti-Defamation League's Center on Extremism, Garcia had once posted a meme that depicted Latino children at a crossroads, faced with the choice to either turn left toward act black or right toward become white supremacist. Garcia had always chosen to turn right, unquote. That's quite the picture, isn't it? The fork in the road with one path leading toward black, another toward white. And it's a choice that, in the meme, is presented with there being a very clear wrong answer. Act black. So, to these Latino groups that espouse white supremacist rhetoric and mindsets, it is in part based in self-preservation. But, and permit me to put my historian hat on, I worked hard for this fucking thing. I deserve to wear it every once in a while.
You should use it sometimes.
I really should. Otherwise, what the hell was the point of going to college? Not the point
what an expensive hat you got there, bud.
Thank you. It's very nice. Not the point. Doesn't matter. While all of that is true, it's also because of Spanish colonial history. Check out these quotes, all from Chapter 3, Them. In an interview with Led Black, an Afro-Dominican activist and the founder of Uptown Collective. Quote, while Led was finding his voice and leaning into his black identity, other Afro-Dominicans around him were still holding on to prejudices. There's a night in particular that Led still thinks about. One evening, During high school, Led's parents had people over at their house to watch a boxing match. Fight night was a huge part of Led's youth. That night, several Dominican men were anxiously staring at the TV screen, raising their fists in the air as they cheered on and heckled the boxers, one of whom was black. Led recalls that one of his father's friends, a 6'4" Afro-Dominican, kept making racial slurs about the black boxer. At one point, Led looked at his dad's friend and said, "But brother, you are black too." His father's friend paused and said, "No, soy blanco oscuro." That translates into, "No, I am dark white." That really stuck with Led. That moment reaffirmed just how much some of his members of his own community wanted to approximate themselves to whiteness, unquote. Now look, you have joked with me years ago, many, many years ago, that I live in a box. Now, it's a very nice box, but I admit that I was sheltered. I have never heard of that term dark white before. What the fuck is that?
Unfortunately, I actually have.
You have?
Yes.
Please,
we'll get into that
Okay.
in the extemporaneous portion, but let's just say that Latinos are not the only ethnic group who are determined to distance themselves from the American notion of blackness.
Okay, I'm going to put a pin in that one. There's also this quote from the late historian Leslie B. Rout Jr., a black American who, quote, observed in his 1976 book, The African Experience in Spanish America, blackness has always been ignored in Latin America. Quote, there probably are many persons of Afro-Indian blood in Mexico, but because it is better to be Indian than black, the latter is ignored. The Indian remains the officially recognized sufferer from oppression, and there is no desire to either add another group to this category or delve into the issue of African cultural contributions, unquote. Full disclosure, I changed one word in there to black because, frankly, I'm not allowed.
The word was negroid.
He's allowed. I'm not. Just a bit. Just a little bit. You have more of a card in that camp than I do. But the idea comes across all the same, right? And it references the Spanish racial caste system where you naturally had white Europeans at the top, then white Spanish colonials, then just a delightful kaleidoscope of mixtures running all the way down to indigenous people, and at the very bottom, black slaves. That clearly has stuck with these Latino groups, and it even stuck with the Dominicans because remember, next door to the Dominican Republic was Haiti.
Yep.
And if you'll recall, Haiti was a French colony, and the French looked at that Spanish racial caste system and said, good idea, let's improve upon that. And they made it absolutely absurd with the amount of different kinds of racial beings you could be, going down to like eighths or something like that.
I think 16ths,
Even
because that was how it was legally defined, whether or not, like, who owned you and if you could be owned.
Yeah,
maybe?
yeah. Kind of fucking stupid, ain't it?
It's almost like they made the whole thing up.
Of course they fucking did. It's stupid.
My God.
But that racism continues to this day where the Dominicans want nothing to do with Haiti. And we'll get into Haiti later. That's a whole fucking thing. But all of this, I think, is even better explained with this quote. Quote, while there's always been a clear and social and racial hierarchy in Latin America, race has rarely been seen through the same lens as the United States' black and white racial binaries, as Led pointed out during our conversation. Rather, race in Latin America has typically been seen through a lens of in-betweenness and fluidity. In Mexico, for instance, the colonialist structure allowed for society's ability to erase or ignore the African presence while lauding their mixedness. I am going to butcher this term, mestizaje, became the...
Mestizaje.
Thank you.
I listened to the audiobook, so I have all the pronunciations in my head.
Appreciate you. Became the catch-all term most Mexicans use to define themselves, consequently driving many to emphasize their indigenous roots and, when possible, their lighter European roots. According to the late Mexican anthropologist Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran, who spent decades studying marginalized communities in Mexico, dark-skinned Mexicans were constantly trying to conceal their African descent under colonial rule. In other words, the colonial hierarchy enabled and encouraged many to hide behind their mixed heritage. Similarly, countless other ethnic identities across Latin America were constructed around the illusion that they were raceless or, when convenient, explicitly of European descent. In a place like the Dominican Republic, which is among the top 5 countries in the world with the largest percentage of African diaspora, this illusion of racelessness was combined with a brutal history of suppressing the nation's black identity. This all comes back to the sins of the Spanish colonial racial caste system. My point is that, along with self-preservation, again, that when in Rome, do as the Romans do mentality, this is also the consequence of centuries of organized and complex systemic racial hierarchies smashing into the more simplistic but equally ridiculous binary racist system in the United States of white versus black, resulting in this clusterfuck.
Yeah, I think one of the things in the intro that she says really hit me as I read through a second time with some of these negative feelings intact. It was, quote, "The U.S.'s legacy of spreading American exceptionalism in Latin America has cast a long shadow.
Oh, yeah.
We did this."
Yep.
And that has made me reconsider my inclination towards hatred in general. Honestly, it's still there, but now I think it's more focused and maybe less directly aligned against whites.
That's true. We in the United States are very profoundly guilty for at least continuing this mindset. Consider what I said earlier about the 2 separate systems of racism colliding. There's another quote from Chapter 3 that illustrates this well. In an interview with Ruth Pion, Afro-Dominican tour guide and feminist activist, quote, "Latin Americans look north and can clearly see the way Black Americans have been criminalized, marginalized, and oppressed for centuries, from slavery to Jim Crow laws, to the war on drugs, to the rise of Trumpism. They've seen the way Black Americans have fought hard for their basic survival. They've seen the ways in which white rage violently operates, fueled by anti-blackness. Now, while the Latin American context allows many of its constituents, including dark-skinned people, to blur the racial lines, blend in and out of whiteness, and otherize black people, that dance doesn't really exist in the United States. In the United States, racial consciousness falls into rigid binaries that are unmovable. You are either white or you are black. This means that many Latinos will opt to claim some form of whiteness if they can, hiding under the guise of being Hispanic or Latino, labels that are vague and insulate Latinos from the racial binary. Many will do everything in their power to ensure that they are never seen as true blacks, as Ruth said, unquote. And that's shown in other interviews where Ramos will occasionally talk to people who are going, "But you're black." "No, I'm Hispanic." "But ma'am, you have blacker skin. You have the hair. You are black." "No, I am Hispanic." As detailed before, this is about self-preservation. This is about identifying not with the oppressed, the underdog, the abused, but with the safer option. It is understandable, but it's also really fucking gross.
Yeah, I think this is indicative of another tacit position of the monoparty. A complete evasion of responsibility for colonialism. Obviously, each fork uses a different approach. The right says, it was fine. Well, the left says, we'll get to it eventually.
Yeah.
But neither seems to have any intention of actually confronting the legacy of American colonialism.
Absolutely. And why would they? They're beholden to the people who benefit the most from that legacy of American colonialism. The amount of wealth we, let's be honest, stole from these nations in Central and South America. That's where the term banana republics comes from, for Christ's sake. But even beyond that, whenever the elections roll around, do you notice something? Do you notice how the border suddenly becomes a very, very big deal? It's preying on the fears of voters even beyond the borders in the vast interior of the country, where the majority of the red voters are, by the way, the ones who are super far away from the migrants, saying this incredibly gross stuff about how it's a migrant invasion, and they're taking our gerbs, and they're illegal aliens, making a mockery of our system, and we need to do something to stop them. And if Democrats don't run on anything other than being tough on the border, code for being cruel to migrants, much like how they need to run on being tough on crime, which is code for being cruel to black people, they're shellacked by Republicans. It's institutional and systemic nonsense and bullshit. And it just keeps happening over and over and over again, regardless of the administration in power at the time, regardless of the logic and the sense that we try to inject back into the conversation. Such as, wonderful segue, from Chapter 3, in an interview with Isabel, a pseudonym for a 30-something hair salon owner in the Bronx, New York, and a Donald Trump supporter. Quote, however, by the FBI's account, national violent crime rates were decreasing in 2022 compared to 2021. And interestingly enough, the states that Donald Trump won in the 2020 election have, on average, higher murder rates than traditionally blue states. But reality didn't matter. Perception did. Fox News and conservatives ran with this narrative and injected racially charged ads into the media landscape. From Wisconsin to Florida and California, countless Republican candidates strategically tied their Democratic opponents to Black Lives Matter, in hopes of resuscitating the same images that were still circling in Isabel's mind. Those of black people looting and disrupting her safety. Republican strategy ended up failing to materialize into that big red wave they predicted at the ballot box in 2022. But their fear-mongering penetrated voters' psyches. And not just white voters. About a year before the 2022 election, an Axios Ipsos Telemundo poll found that crime was climbing the ranks as a key issue, suddenly becoming a top worry for Latino voters. Then, a couple of months before Election Day, the Pew Research Center similarly found that 70% of registered Latino voters noted violent crime as one of their top voting issues, prioritizing it way over immigration. As Dr. Gabriel Sanchez, who tracks Latino polling at the Brookings Institution, told me, quote, whenever it's driven by more perception than actual crime, people's feelings on this across the country are that crime is out of control, unquote. For some, like Isabel, that perception seems to have only magnified with time. It is as if the Black Lives Matter protests, combined with the 2022 crime narrative, vindicated her prejudices, giving her once deeply buried discomforts an acceptable outlet to emerge, this time without any shame. She wasn't alone, unquote. It is ridiculous and frankly exasperating, and yet here we are. Remember the 2024 election? Remember the border crisis then?
Sadly, yes.
Don't even need to remember. Do you know what's happening now?
Yep.
They are preying on this again, and it's fucking working.
Yeah, I mean, it was honestly especially wild to me how some of the people she interviews even see the outline of this, like, monoparty related manipulation. Even the man in the one in chapter 1 says, I think, he took the red pill, which is like a Matrix reference to seeing the truth and seeing how both parties are manipulating him. But then he somehow ends up seeing the truth as a transparently populist hard-right xenophobia.
Yeah, but, I have to wonder, and I hate going down this path, but we have to wonder this. Is it just easier to embrace bigotry instead of acknowledging systemic problems?
Well, it's at least easier to try to convince people to do that.
It is easier to convince people of that.
That is easier.
But we've got plenty of people who are buying it.
True.
And they're buying it wholeheartedly, even though they could see the same contradictions we're seeing. They're seeing the same mono party as us. They don't care. They just go into it with the bigotry. And maybe it's because that at least when you're being bigoted, you've reestablished some small measure of control over a situation that, let's be honest, is outside your individual control. And you have a chance to actually act upon your fear and do something about it and make a difference. Even if in that difference you're hurting people that have next to nothing to do with your situation. But every little bit counts, right?
It counts to someone.
Yeah, it counts.
Even if that person is just some hateful nightmare person in Washington.
Yeah, but it makes you feel better.
True.
I guess. You know what? Maybe it's best summarized in this quote at the end of chapter 3. Quote, "When I first entered Isabel's hair salon, my main question was, how could this be? How could so many Afro-Latinos support Trump and his racist policies? By the end of the day, I understood the answer. As American politics continues to overtly embrace anti-blackness in the post-Trump era, it evokes a feeling that is buried deep inside of us. Some Latinos' instinct to otherize, vilify, and criminalize blackness in the United States is, once again, one of colonialism's darkest living legacies. Unfortunately, it's what we've been taught to do. When it's presented to us, we recognize it and often lean into it," unquote. You know what really grinds my gears?
What grinds your gears?
I hate how easy it is to be a jackass.
Yeah.
I hate how easy it is to be a white supremacist.
Yeah.
You don't even need to be white to be a white supremacist. It's so easy. Just add racism.
Yeah, just blame a black person when something happens and you're set.
Hell, you can be black yourself.
Yeah,
but
even if you're black, blame a black person and you're set.
Blame a black person and don't identify as black.
Yes.
Don't identify as a loser.
Very much so.
Don't identify as the oppressed. You're not the oppressed. You're not the colonized. You're the winner. You're the colonizer. You're the one who's going to be in charge. By seeing systemic problems, I admit it feels extremely overwhelming and all-encompassing, and that it's inconceivable for you as an individual actually being able to do anything about it. Like, hell, what we're doing right now, yapping into the void. Please hit like and subscribe and comment. It feels like an attempt on our part to reestablish control, but at least we're doing something positive. These far-right people, what they're doing, not so much.
Yeah, it's just such intense and all-encompassing cognitive dissonance. Like the inclination to both use the label of Hispanic to distance oneself from racism, but also distance oneself from coloredness, especially blackness. It's just incredible. And in some ways, a little reminiscent of how other white-adjacent groups, and honestly, even some progressive whites, try to simultaneously associate themselves with white privilege, but also eschew responsibility for racism. It's understandable, but it's still very difficult to be sympathetic to, though I intend to continue to try on that front.
Look, of course it is. And honestly, I don't think we have to try and sympathize with it. That's different from trying to understand it. But regardless of us trying to be sympathetic or understanding, it's leaving us feeling exasperated.
Would you describe that exasperation as perpetual? Alrighty, so race stuff aside,
It's
Christian nationalism.
Oh man.
Because, like, I'm sympathetic to the race thing in general because I recognize that race is the axis along which America controls its proletariat.
Yeah.
I hate Christian nationalists. I hate any theocrat because you have to be completely historically ignorant to imagine that a theocratic government has ever been successful in the long term.
Yeah, long term, sure, but I think for a lot of these Christian nationalists, they're not thinking that long term.
But isn't the kingdom of God supposed to be eternal?
Yes, but see, no. See, what I mean by that is the second coming, Revelation.
Oh, right. I forget that we're at the end times.
Yeah, we're at the. Haven't you forgotten?
Yeah, that's true.
2012 happened. Oh God, that was 13 years ago.
Yeah, we're due for another apocalypse.
Oh God,
You gotta have an apocalypse every 10 to 20 years, or you'll forget.
I would. Yeah, forgetting. I would love to forget these apocalypses. Apocalypsi.
When you need a plural, I don't know if it counts as an apocalypse.
Doesn't matter, not the point. But point is that I think for a fair amount of these evangelicals, especially, the long-term plan is being in heaven.
True.
Rocking it with the big J.
Being raptured during the end times. That's true.
And leaving the rest of us poor, unfortunate souls behind.
Yeah, to get, eaten by a dragon who comes out of a lake of fire or some crazy shit like that.
I skimmed most of that part of the Bible, by the way.
I loved Revelations, but only because when you read it and don't take it as prophecy, it's very clearly a guy who found some mushrooms, ate them, and had one hell of a trip.
Yeah, and it was a hell of a trip about the Roman Empire.
Yeah, exactly. If I lived in the Roman Empire at the time that John the Revelator was doing his thing, and I accidentally ate some hallucinogenic mushrooms, I could see having a similar hallucination because it's so politically contemporary and bonkers.
It is bonkers. And it's also, at least here in the United States, not super sustainable. In Part 2, Traditionalism, Chapter 4, Army of God. Boy.
Oh, God.
Yes, exactly. Here's a quote.
Dios mío!
There's a quote here which says the following, quote, "However, there's a snag in the Christian nationalist plan. In the last few decades, the white evangelical Christian population has declined by approximately 1/3. In 1996, about 65% of Americans identified as Christian and white. And by 2020, that number dropped to 44%. Recruiting exclusively white evangelicals, therefore, is simply not a sustainable strategy because Christian nationalism is as much a theological ideology as it is a political strategy. Extremist Republicans can't deny the country's demographic shifts and are reluctantly advancing an alternate version of God's plan by reaching out to Latinos in order to achieve their desired political outcome. To survive, the movement needs Latinos and pastors like Luis Cabrera, who can effectively reach them. After all, the statistics they are noticing are shockingly encouraging. Approximately 55% of Latino Protestants support the Christian nationalist ideology. Black Protestants aren't nearly so interested. There's no doubt that the far right sees something promising in Latinos. Unquote.
Yeah, I can imagine why Black Protestants are maybe a little bit more suspicious of a Christian nationalist institution, given how that went for them the last time.
I don't know. They had a not nice time a while ago, just a couple of decades ago. Hell, just a couple of years ago. Hell, probably just yesterday.
Well, and it's arguable that the institution in the American South that enabled slavery was, I'm not going to say directly Christian nationalist, But one of the things that the Confederacy was not particularly happy with was the notion of things like freedom of religion.
Mm-hmm.
The Confederacy was the Christian nationalist version of America.
Was and remains.
Exactly.
With all of the neo-Confederates rolling around. General Sherman did nothing wrong, and further to the point, he didn't do enough.
Yeah.
But, yeah, no, this is also especially effective with Latinos because we got a little bit of history to go through here. So walk with me through this. Quote, "The notion of Christian nationalism may be more familiar to Latinos than we want to think. Pundits have pushed us to understand this idea as an inherently American and contemporary ideology. But the core of Christian nationalism, that melding of righteous indoctrination and governance, is found in the essence of colonialism, of colonization. It's based on this idea that a superior force or being has the right to impose a set of ideals on an entire population and land. The same way the Spanish colonizers began doing in the New World in the 15th century. That's why Christian nationalism isn't foreign to Latinos. It has deep roots in our history, our bloodlines, our culture, and in the way we've been socialized to view hierarchies. As Latinos, we have, for generations, internalized an unconscious form of submissiveness that normalizes indoctrination. In many ways, history tells us that we have always acted as the army of God. The Latino mind is a product of centuries of colonialism, a brutal force that engraved Christian nationalism's core tenets into our psyche. Shannon Rivers, a member of the Akimel Oldam River people, excuse me for mispronouncing that, and an advocate for indigenous people, sees this very clearly. He, too, believes that today's form of Christian nationalism is rooted in the doctrine of discovery, the mandate that provided a legal basis for Europeans' religiously fueled colonial conquests. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI Borgia issued a key papal bull, Inter Caetera, which authorized Spain and Portugal to colonize the New World and subjugate indigenous people to their religion. The Pope declared that, quote, "the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself," unquote. For centuries, these types of decrees built on the Spanish crown's royal patronage, powers that granted the monarchy authority over faith and church in the New World, and allowed the crown to control all ecclesiastical affairs. The culmination of these policies and vision, fueled by the belief of the Spanish and Portuguese that God had deemed them superior, propelled Christian nationalism in the Western Hemisphere between the 15th and 19th centuries. Thus, the fusion between church and state and the conversion of indigenous to Catholicism became a key objective of the Spanish crown throughout Latin America, unquote. This is something that goes further back. This is the fault of Rome.
Damn you, Caesar!
Damn you, papists! The lapsed Catholic says.
Yeah.
But this is a problem that has been plaguing us for centuries. And modern day evangelicals are finally starting to understand that it's not just the white people who are ready and willing to believe in a doctrine that decides the separation of church and state is a dumb, stupid idea, but rather we should smush them all together and act according to the laws and will of God and whoever speaks for God.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's often a very not godlike human between all the rest of us and God, and that's really what I find suspicious.
Yeah, it is absolutely suspicious, but that's been the case for centuries. That will continue to be the case for centuries. Just this ongoing suspicion of who exactly is speaking for the Lord here. What is the Lord's actual message here? It seems like it gets kind of muddied from time to time. Don't you remember from back in episode 3, please view, like, and subscribe, where we were talking about this concept that empathy is a sin?
Right, yeah, that's true.
We had to quote the Bible, the words of the Lord and Savior, to debunk that little dumb-ass fucking statement from a pastor.
Yeah.
These are the messengers of the Lord, and these are the messengers who are trying to cultivate an army of God that isn't just white, primarily, but not just white, but also Latino.
But, Keeley, if you are Latino, you still must be a white supremacist. Because if I think about it, this is all probably kind of connected, right? This inclination to pull people into this idea where the ideal person to be is a white Christian.
Mm-hmm.
As much as I'd like to imagine that these are two separate groups of people, the groups of people referring to themselves as, quote, dark white, and the groups of people referring to themselves as a member of a Christian nation are probably very similar groups of people.
They are. And perhaps one of the things that's connecting them beyond this historical tradition that is baked deep into their psyche is this sense of belonging. This is how they, at least, feel like they should become a part of this nation in a way. Like, it's not all of them, naturally. This is not a monolith. And that's the thing that we've been trying to debunk in this whole fucking book since page 1, is that the Latino group is not a monolith. Not all Latinos, just like not all whites, just like not all blacks, etc., so on and so forth, are going to have this psyche within them that they can't overcome. But a lot do.
Yeah.
It's there. There's a potential for it. There's a potential to overcome it. But what are the voices from the other side that are trying to get these people to overcome that?
True, very apostatic voices. People who do not believe in or follow the words of God.
Yeah.
That's the way that they see them.
And a lot of these, a lot of this information is coming from word of mouth and also coming from social media.
Yep.
And this goes into some more political stuff as well. But what was notable to me was that in Chapter 6, Stories and Mourning in the Era of Disinformation, there's a quote here about how Latinos seem to handle mis and disinformation. And I want to quote it in full and see what you think about it. Quote, "All this means that Latinos are overexposed to high volumes of mis and disinformation through the different channels they use, channels that are typically harder to monitor. Take WhatsApp, for example. The platform is the most used messaging platform among Latinos on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border.
And end-to-end encrypted.
Yes, this encrypted messaging application gives Latinos a sense of intimacy, privacy, and comfort. But it also makes them vulnerable to deception. Those are the spaces where mis and disinformation are spread and often go unchecked, since fact checkers, watchdogs, and even the platforms themselves can't access the encrypted platform. There, someone can easily share a YouTube video of a self-appointed expert whose content isn't required to go through the typical arduous verification process traditional news outlets have to undergo, for the most part. See Fox News. Even open platforms like Facebook aren't safe for Latinos, especially those who are predominantly Spanish speakers. We know that misinformation isn't effectively monitored in English. See episode 3. Hit like and subscribe. Well, it's way worse in Spanish. Tech companies have not developed a symmetrical and consistent system to take down misinformation in other languages the same way they have attempted to do for English language content, leaving false narratives to spread unchecked, even when they violate a platform's terms of service. According to the nonprofit Avaz, Facebook flags just 30% of misinformation in Spanish, compared to 70% in English. This means that misinformation in Spanish can remain posted for longer periods of time than in English before it's finally taken down. This may seem a mere misstep, but it has real-life consequences. A 2022 Washington Post analyst found that 40% of Latinos who relied on Spanish language social media for their views and news believed that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, compared to 31% of Latinos who relied on English social media channels. Unquote. Now again, this kind of diverges and digresses into a mis and disinformation thing, but this is also where they're getting their information on white nationalism and on Christian nationalism and on anti-communism and on all of these conspiracies that have to deal with medicine, for instance. There is a serious problem in the Latino community about so-called folk medicine being used instead of vaccines. This was a problem during COVID, and this is becoming a problem now with the rise of fucking measles. Bringing that shit back? Polio? This is something that we are only just now beginning to realize is a problem. And how do you connect with a people like that? How do you reach out to them and help them through all of this mis and disinformation, when we're not even monitoring it because we can't speak the fucking language?
I think I can summarize my reaction to that by rounding back to something that we discussed earlier in the segment, which is the notion of dark white. So I have a MAGA cousin.
Okay.
And what is very notable to me about the way that Paola Ramos describes these white supremacist Latinos, it's even hard to say.
No, it's fine.
Describes my cousin almost to a T.
Really?
She is an evangelical Christian.
Okay.
She gets, I'm going to say 100% of her news from social media.
Okay.
And she had some very particular, I don't know, did you see the Super Bowl halftime show this year, Kendrick Lamar?
I did not. I've heard about it, but not extensively. But let's explain to the folks at home.
A number of his very high-profile tracks, including the most recent diss track against Drake that he won like 4 Grammys for or whatever.
Not Like Us.
Yeah, Not Like Us. It's a fantastic track.
Yes.
Like all Super Bowl shows, the sound balancing was fucking terrible.
Of course it was.
So you could barely tell what he was saying, and everybody. But it was a very black show. There were lots of black performers. He's a black artist. His music is very concerned with black issues and black culture.
Right. Like most of his rap, like I am not well versed in it because I'm not the target demographic, but I'm trying to get into the lore behind a lot of his rap, and holy shit, that is a tome's worth.
Yes, there's a reason that Kendrick is very popular.
Yeah, this guy's really fucking good at what he does.
So my cousin hated that halftime show. She
Really?
hated it. And the reason that she hated it is, quote, because it was too black.
Sorry?
My cousin is black.
Like, not even mixed, but straight up black.
No, straight up, no question. She has been black identified her whole life. And when my mother, who had this conversation with her, because I don't talk to this cousin for many reasons.
Yeah, that's understandable.
She said, my mother was like, well, but, I mean, aren't you black? Like, aren't you part of the black? And she said, I'm not part of the black community.
What?
So clearly this whole trend that has led Latinos to be racist Christian nationalist is not just working on Latinos. It is working in English on blood and soil born American black people.
Oh, shit.
So, like, that part of the reason that this book was so illuminating for me is because it tells me how they got my cousin, using exactly the same tack, except in English. And to answer the question of how do we reach these people, honestly, I have no fucking idea. But we know that it's possible because we know that it did not just start this way.
No.
White Republicans figured out how to get brown and black Latinos on their side against their peers.
Yeah.
And if they could do that, there has got to be a way to pull them back and be like, dude, you were lied to. Look at this man stealing hundreds of billions of dollars from you while pretending that he cares about Christ.
Yeah.
That is what they are. They are not Christian nationalists. And the real Christian nationalists will never get power because that's not popular here.
No. Well, to that, the only thing I can think of as a potential avenue goes back to what we were talking about back in chapter 1, where there was this perception of the colonizers, the white man on the horse, as being the winner, and how humans, God bless these frail, flawed, really silly hunks of meat that are humans, we love winners, don't we?
We do. We love to win.
We love to win. Who wants to lose? Who wants to associate themselves willingly to losers?
Well, Jesus Christ. Not to be a dick about it, but
no, but you know
there
what?
was that one guy.
But you know what? You're right.
Uh-huh.
Jesus Christ was
woke AF.
Yeah.
In fact.
And compared to the Jewish Pharisees and more specifically the wider Roman Empire, at the time, he was kind of a loser, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
And he was on the side of the losers.
Yeah. And it's almost like he lost catastrophically and in a high-profile way in order to demonstrate the cruelty of the winners.
And by losing in such a spectacular and gruesome and horrific way,
he rose again.
And he seems like a bit of a winner now, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. So what you're saying is I should get crucified. Bet.
No.
I'm kidding.
No, please don't. I
don't have that kind of pain tolerance.
Yeah, I like you too much as a friend to have you go through that. I'll file it away, but I'm not gonna. No, we're not acting on.
Well, as long as you don't crucify me, I think we're cool.
No, I'm good. I'm good. I don't.
Yeah, I wouldn't want that anyway, because I don't think things went well for the crucifiers, if I remember correctly. I think like their whole empire imploded or something.
It imploded and rose again as a Christian empire, but
we'll forget that.
Look, the point is that what I think is a possibility, a theory, if you will. Let's just call it a hypothesis. We need to redefine who the winners and the losers actually are here. Because there is, it's true, a perception that being black is being a loser.
Yes, absolutely.
And anything associated with black, especially like welfare, for instance, housing problems, being able to raise a family and not doing a good job about it, all of that is loser shit.
Yes, and in many ways, the American inclination is to, when they have something that they'd like to highlight as loser shit, they associate it with black culture.
Right. But who won the Civil War again?
I don't know. I think it might have been America.
It wasn't Dixieland.
No, it was not.
So, it's the Confederates who are the fucking losers here.
Yep.
It's the slave owners who are the fucking losers here.
Yep.
And, by the way, remember from episode 3, Owned, when we were talking about all of the tech billionaires?
Uh-huh. And how they like to refer to wokeness as ultra-Christianity.
Yeah. And let's think about the personalities of all of these tech billionaires. They're kind of losers, aren't they?
Unbelievably, Mr. Elon Musk Big Titty AI. Unbelievable!
Oh, God, why is Grok...
We're not even going to go into
Yeah, that's-
but we just like you all to know that we are aware of that and horrified
Oh, God.
by the man that is the richest in the world.
I need eye bleach. But the point is that this is incel bullshit loser talk here. And
Yes.
we need to redefine as a society who and what winners are.
Yes.
And the winners in American lore, in the American dream, tend to be the little guy, don't they?
Yes, we love to tell stories about the little guy beating the big, mean, big guy.
Yeah.
That's our bread and butter.
In sports itself, I'm a bit of a sports guy here. I love me hockey. I love the Los Angeles Kings, even though they're a bunch of fucking bums. God damn it.
They're doing their best.
4 times in a row. Jesus fucking Christ. Not the point, doesn't matter. The point is, in sports, yes, we lionize the winners. Boy, do we love to root for underdogs, though.
Well, I mean, look at our big name like fantasy franchises. Star Wars, literally a story about, I mean, granted it's about the Confederacy, but it's about, rebels beating the big guy.
Or in the original trilogy, at least, especially in episode 6, Return of the Jedi, all of those cuddly little Ewoks, those goofy little fuckers.
Yes.
That was more of an allegory for Vietnam.
Yep. Well, exactly. Or look at...
what did they do in the Vietnam War? They fucking won.
Yes, they did. But like Harry Potter, even, or the Hunger Games, over and over and over, it's look at this person who's being stepped on by a system that is unfair and how they accomplish beating that system. They're just retellings of the story of Jesus.
They are retellings of a story of Jesus.
Ideally without the horrible martyring, but...
Yeah, that would be nice as well. But yeah, that's true as well. But also think about all of the martyrs that came after Jesus. Those guys who went... Guys and gals, we have to be very clear about this. There are a lot of women who were disciples and who became saints and who went through some really fucking horrific shit.
Yeah, getting murdered for Jesus is very much a girls and boys kind of deal.
Yeah, and the murder is also really fucking creative too.
Well, it's kind of, I think, if I remember correctly, part of the criteria for being considered a martyr is that the way you died has to be kind of fucked up.
Kind of.
Like some jackass has to decide that you need to die because you believe in Jesus. And he needs to give you the option to live if you don't believe in Jesus. And you have to be like, no, and then get murdered horribly for Jesus.
Yeah, as an
because
example.
That's what Jesus did.
As an example. But the thing is also, where I'm going with this is that all of these stories that we've told about the small man, the everyman, being able to triumph over the forces of evil and whatnot, the one flaw in all of these things is that it is super hyper individualistic.
Yes, all of these stories depend on there being a Jesus.
Yeah, a Jesus that will overcome an empire.
Yes.
As it were. That being said, we can still keep looking to early Christianity and note how many, many people died for an idea. An idea that was not popular in the empire, was loathed in the empire, in fact, and at times brutally suppressed by the empire. And yet, they won.
Yep.
Now, what happened afterwards is a different story, and we don't need to get into that. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that in groups, in solidarity with their fellow Christians, were they able to weather the storm, to keep the idea alive, to pass it down for generations, and eventually subvert and take over the same empire that was brutally murdering them and enslaving them. Solidarity, working with others, cooperating in your community. Maybe these were the actual winners. And maybe to be a winner, you have to be part of a team of winners.
True.
A union of winners.
Uh-oh.
If you will.
I don't think we can say that word. I think that's illegal.
Well, we could probably cut it from the podcast.
No, we'll bleep it out in a way where it's really obvious that you still said the word.
Yeah. But the point is that we don't have to do this alone. We don't have to resist alone.
More importantly, we cannot effectively resist alone.
No. We have to work together with our families, with our friends, with strangers.
Yeah, with people who may hold some beliefs that we find odious.
Yes.
That's what coalition building is.
And for a lot of these people that have gone down a very deep and dark rabbit hole that turned them into white nationalists and into Christian nationalists, these people wanted a sense of belonging. And for a decent chunk of them, because of simply how the ideologies themselves are defined in hierarchy, ultimately, they will fall short. They're not going to find true belonging here. There is something here. At the very end, chapter 9, 2045, the Cuban Confederate, the undocumented Border Patrol agent, and America the Free. Ramos interviews two people. Raul Rodriguez, a veteran and former CBP officer who was eventually fired because he's an undocumented immigrant from Mexico.
Right.
And Chris Monzon, a Cuban-descended ex-far-right extremist. These guys were hardcore white supremacists and Christian nationalists. And eventually, because of who they are as individuals, they were burned by the same groups that they tried to be a part of and were cast out. Here's this quote. One of the first things Raul and Chris independently realized was just how tenuous white power really is. After everything they believed and did, even when they had found a sense of belonging within the groups that epitomized the existence of whiteness or Americanness, they found themselves being rejected. It was a fantasy. Soon after Raul was outed as undocumented, almost everyone in his circle turned their back on him. He told me, Ramos, some of his so-called friends and colleagues won't even wave back at him if he sees them on the street, and Republican politicians have done nothing to help his immigration case move forward. Quote, I put it in everything possible that I could for this country, just for them to tell me, we're not going to do anything for you, unquote. He let his voice trail off in disbelief. Raul served his country for over 25 years, risked his life for the United States, and proudly wore a uniform that reflected his loyalty. But no matter how shiny and spotless Raul's uniform was every day, it was tainted by a dark legacy of systemic racism, abuse, and racial violence, which meant that in the blink of an eye, Raul's power was gone the moment his true origins were revealed. All along, he was simply a puppet of the system, not someone with a real voice. Similarly, Chris recognized that he had been merely the League of South's token Latino. Once he had time to reflect and look back, he noticed things he hadn't wanted to admit at the time. According to Chris, the League members used to casually call him Mexican or say, "You came from a banana boat."
Oh my God.
Or remind him that he was not fully Aryan. Chris brushed it off as long as he could, but by the time he decided to resign, he had recognized they would never truly see him as one of theirs. That abrupt awakening compelled Raul and Chris to take an honest look at themselves and finally reckon with their identities and history. Once Raul found out about his immigration status, he realized he didn't really know who he was outside of a fabricated American identity. In 2019, Raul decided to do a 23andMe DNA and ancestry test. The results indicated that he was predominantly indigenous and black.
Wah, wah.
Raul couldn't believe it. He told his wife that he thought the results were wrong, so he decided to get tested by another company. The results indicated the same. "How am I black?" "Right?" Raul told me. "Well, I did my research. It turns out that Raul's family is originally from Coahuila. I mispronounced that. I'm sorry. A northern Mexican state that became a place of refuge for many enslaved people from the American South. After years of slavery under colonial Spanish power, Mexico fully abolished slavery in 1837, nearly 37 years before the U.S. outlawed it with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Historians like Alice Baumgartner, author of South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico and the Road to the Civil War, estimate that anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 enslaved black Americans escaped to northern Mexico. This included people from Texas, but also from states like Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. That state itself became emblematic of black resistance and anti-slavery politics over the years, especially as the South was battling in the Civil War. Mexican residents and the Mexican army often fought slave catchers and slaveholders who crossed the border to search for enslaved fugitives. As Raul was talking about his background, I could sense that he spoke with the same type of pride and energy that had filled his voice as he reminisced about his Border Patrol and Navy days. Quote, "It explains everything I kind of wondered about," Raul said, and added that he'd always thought his skin was particularly dark, even for someone with indigenous ancestry.
Oh, buddy.
While Raul wrapped his head around the origins of his skin color, Chris spent time trying to unpack the roots of his leanings toward identifying with an oppressor. Chris eventually dug deeper into his roots and recognized that his Cuban family descended from Spanish aristocrats who had perpetuated the racial caste system on the island. It all goes back to the colonial days, he told me. His family migrated with that colonial mentality to the United States, subsequently informing the way Chris was raised. Even though they faced many obstacles and racism along the way, that commitment to a colonial hierarchy continued to mark the lives of his family members. We tend to gravitate toward radical politics, toward authoritarianism, toward fascism, Chris told me. It's just in our blood. White supremacy in the United States meets and affirms that colonial mindset by tapping into immigrants' deepest biases and fear of the unknown. Yet, Chris realized that no matter how hard he tried to find purpose in that fear and emulate the social hierarchy his family had embraced in Cuba, he would never be part of the white majority in America. Chris even realized that his own heroes, those Cubans who fought with the Confederacy, never made it to the highest ranks of white power after all. His main hero, Confederate Colonel Ambrosio Jose Gonzalez, who was the highest-ranking Cuban officer, was repeatedly denied promotion to brigadier general, despite having a stellar record. It turns out the story of the Cuban Confederate was always better in fiction than reality, unquote. This highlights the biggest problem, in my opinion, of white supremacy and, to a lesser extent, Christian nationalism. It is inherently elitist.
Yes, because if you have elites, they were selected by God.
Yes, and it is self-defeating, because when the white supremacists take out the blackest of Americans, they'll go after the next blackest.
Yep.
And work their way up the racial caste system that they inherited from the Spanish and the French, all the way up to the white people.
Yep, at which point they start to discriminate against who they consider to be Jewish, because that's the next step. There is always another group to step on.
And even after the Jews. Do you remember your American history where back in the 1800s, the Irish
And the Italians, because they were Catholics.
and the Polish, that's true too. It didn't matter that the Irish people are white as fuck.
The whitest, possibly.
They are the pastiest motherfuckers that ever set foot on God's green earth. And yet, they were treated like black people.
Yep.
Their skin color didn't fucking matter.
N-words inside out, I believe, was the epithet.
Something like that, yeah.
Something that horrifying.
And by the way, after them, the white people with the mixed ancestries, not even black or brown people, other whites who were designated as not white enough.
Yeah, just somebody a little too Mediterranean.
Yeah. Or a little too Eastern European.
Mm-hmm.
And we work up and 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 up, all the way up to essentially the most inbred white person you could possibly find. And I'm sure you could find at least one thing wrong with them as well. And
Just some fucking Habsburg.
And even before we get to that point, but let's say for this thought experiment, we get all the way up there. The rest of the world is dead.
Yep.
You
have nothing.
This is a suicide cult.
Yes.
White nationalism and fascism is a suicide cult.
Even worse, it's pretty much only a suicide cult once it stopped being a murder cult.
It's a murder-suicide cult. Fuck
Oh,
it.
no.
And by the way, going back to the Christian nationalists, going back to Revelations, that requires a whole bunch of other people to die as well.
Yes. What is it? Everybody but 144,000 people?
Give
or
or
take?
according to some sects of Christianity, yes, these far-right groups that we, the people, are fighting are murder-suicide cults. And the sooner we figure that out, the sooner we'll realize that the murder-suicide cults are the real fucking losers in this society, not us.
Yeah, that is some loser shit.
Because what do winners do? Winners elevate people.
Yes, along with them winning. That's, in fact, you win and then you bring people into your winning circle.
Yes.
That's sort of the point.
Winners are beloved. Winners are adored.
Winners extend their winning to others.
Yes. So, I feel like a couple of people by the name of Carl and Frederick may have talked about how we, the people, can win against these fucking losers that are trying to take everything from us and kill our descendants and wipe away any pride in our ancestry that doesn't include being completely 110% white.
Yeah, honestly, completely 110% from the part of the British Isles that they think is the best.
Or not even the British Isles, the Scandinavian Isles.
Oh, right. Yeah, now they like the Swedes.
Yeah, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You think, as Catholics, you're gonna be left alone? Fuck no!
Well, it feels to me like the central delusion that the elites on the right specifically are kind of cultivating in their side at the moment is the idea that you get to choose how you are defined. Because that's one of the biggest differences between the right and the left, at least in America, is who determines what demographic you're a part of. On the left, it's you. You say, I identify as white, you're white. If you identify as white and you have very brown skin, people will laugh at you. But that's neither here nor there. If you identify as gay, you're gay. If you identify as trans, you're trans. Mm-hmm. On the right, you're gay if you've ever had a sexual interaction with somebody who is of your same identified gender, regardless of whether or not you say you're gay or not. Mm-hmm. You're trans if you started taking hormones, regardless of how you identify. You're black if people say you're black. You're white if people say you're white. You don't get to make that choice.
Funny how the right is not that respectful of the individual, huh?
Yes, but they are willing to be respectful of your individual delusion if it plays into their politics. They're happy to let you, a person who would never, ever be identified as white by the white majority, identify as white in order to empower white supremacists. That's fine. You can identify as white as long as you understand that when they win, you won't be.
Right.
And it doesn't seem like a lot of people understand that when they win, that goes away. You don't get to say, oh, no, I'm dark white. No, you're not. You're black. You don't get to choose to not be black. Do you think black people would have chosen to continue being black if that was a fucking option?
Yeah, and that actually also extends to trans people as well. Do you honestly think that people who would go through the utter hell of society treating them as basically lepers,
Pretty much.
would they willingly do that if that was just a delusion? By the way, quick aside, you know who dealt with lepers?
I don't know. I'm trying to remember who historically famously befriended lepers when it was illegal. Can you help me out?
It was some brown Jewish guy.
Oh my God, a brown Jew?
Yeah.
Couldn't be me.
Yeah, it couldn't be. But
It was Jesus Christ.
it was Jesus fucking Christ. Jesus Herbert Walker Christ.
Oh, George. Yeah, it's
ridiculous.
what I was gonna say is it's impressive. What is impressive to me, not in a good way, but in the same way that what Hitler did to me was very impressive. In the sense that I was like, wow, I would not have guessed you could have been able to do something that horrible. You are an innovative piece of shit. What's impressive to me is that some relatively small cabal of what seems to be mostly technocrats and oil barons has managed to pollute this much of our culture.
It is truly impressive, isn't it?
It's amazing what oil money can do, I guess.
It's amazing what big money, regardless of the sector, can do.
Very true.
It's because we have a system that encourages that, doesn't it?
Yes. Which I personally think means that we can do something about this. Because there can't be, there has to be, in our collection of elites, people who actually have read about the past. People who have read about the French Revolution. People who have read about the fall of Rome. And realize what this concentration of power underneath a very small, physically locatable cabal of jackasses ends with.
Generally, it's not great for the people in power.
No, usually it's bladed.
Usually, yes.
And I do imagine that there's got to be maybe a couple of people who have their things and think, hey, I would be happy to have a little bit less stuff, maybe even a lot less stuff, if it meant me and my children were safe from the knife.
Yeah. But to push back on that a little bit, we're again dealing with a murder-suicide cult here.
That's true.
And let's say, for the sake of argument, that the techno-aristocrats aren't themselves, like, Christian nationalists.
Yeah.
More likely, they're not Christian nationalists.
No, they're the much worse Nazi kind of just regular technocrat authoritarian.
Yeah. Or some of them might not even be, like, super into the white supremacy to the point that it becomes a murder-suicide cult. I think also that those in power believe that the world is coming to an end anyway, and you don't have to be religious to think that.
True. There do seem to be some impending implications of nuclear war, so that's not great.
And even beyond the nuclear war, climate change.
True. I forget that people are worried about that.
Yeah, people are still actually worried about that. Now, what should be done, probably too late at this point, but we could still try anyway to at least mitigate some of it, to try and save as much of us as possible. Those in power might also be thinking that, the world's going to end anyway. Billions of people are going to die. I might as well hoard all the shit I can and retreat to my island bunker in the middle of fucking nowhere and lock the door behind me and throw away the key and weather out what is coming. It's entirely possible that there is no long-term thinking here.
That's true.
And even if that's not true, this is also a system of economics and politics that doesn't encourage long-term thinking.
Also
isn't it?
true.
This is a system that emphasizes measuring economies by quarters. Not 4-year terms, not 2-year terms, not even yearly.
Every
Quarters.
3 months.
3 months. That's as far ahead as it goes.
That's true.
Or our current system of government, thinking about the people in the House who have 2-year term limits. And what do they do for the vast majority of those term limits? They campaign and solicit donations. All they're thinking about is the next term.
Yeah, what is it? House members now spend something like 40% of all their time doing fundraising calls or something like that. Something insane.
Yeah, and they're not even their aides are doing the calls. They are the ones doing the calls.
Yeah, I mean their aides are also doing them, but like I think aides call random people and they're spending 40% of their governing time just calling rich people, being like, "Money, please. Money, please."
They're spending nearly half, if not more than half, of their time not actually governing of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Well, governing of and by a very small, specific subset of the people.
But when I talk about the people, I don't give a flying fuck about them. I'm talking about us.
Yeah.
The ones who should be in charge. So, we've got so much else to talk about and probably not a lot of time left, but maybe we should end talking about one last big topic. A certain Latin American ruler who has graced his admittedly really fucking charismatic presence on our TVs recently.
Yep.
President Nayib Bukele. There is a chapter here in Part 3, Trauma, Chapter 7, Wounds, Democracies, and Strongmen, that features President Bukele rather prominently. And I want to quote this bit about him. It's kind of a run-through, but tell me if you think some of this may or may not sound a little tiny bit familiar.
All right.
Quote, Nayib Bukele is one of Latin America's most popular leaders. As of the summer of 2023, his approval ratings in El Salvador were around 90%. Higher.
Jesus.
Yeah, higher than any other leader on the continent. Some consider him an authoritarian figure, while others think of him as a hero. Bukele, a former businessman, was elected in 2019 and made history for being the first president in El Salvador to emerge from neither of the nation's two major parties, running as an anti-establishment candidate. The 39-year-old rose to power amid a disillusioned populace.
Jesus, he's 39?
As of
Wow.
2023, so I think he's like 41
He is
now.
young. That's crazy.
Frustrated by the country's long history of corruption, violent crime, and instability, Bukele felt like a fresh start for El Salvador. He was politically unaffiliated. He had a youthful vibe, often appearing on broadcasts with his baseball cap backwards, aviators, tight jeans, and leather jackets. He was a savvy social media communicator, relying on X, formerly known as Twitter, to make important policy announcements. Sound familiar?
No, unfortunately.
And he made Bitcoin an official currency.
I remember that, yeah.
Alongside the dollar, which was being used since 2001, opening the door to more tourism. But underneath the hip aesthetic, Bukele mirrored a type of traditional populism that felt intimately familiar to Latin Americans. While casting himself as a sort of messiah of the people, Bukele leveraged his popularity to rule with an iron fist. 2 years after his election, Bukele changed his X profile bio to say, quote, "world's coolest dictator," unquote.
I remember that too.
He since changed it. That sarcastic bio description captured his character. Bukele was constantly trolling democracy. Since taking office, Bukele worked to consolidate his power and exploit it as much as possible. He used his legislative supermajority to pack El Salvador's highest court with his loyalists, employed intimidation tactics to pass favored bills, and defied the Constitution by announcing his run for re-election in 2024, despite the Constitution's ban on consecutive terms.
Uh-oh.
Eventually, by November 2023, El Salvador's Supreme Electoral Tribunal had approved Bukele's bid for re-election. Bukele also developed a hostile environment for the press, driving El Faro, an esteemed newspaper once based in the nation's capital, to relocate their headquarters to Costa Rica due to the harassment and defamation they were receiving from the state. Bukele rarely held interviews with his own country's news outlets, but he loved to sit down with Tucker Carlson when Carlson was at Fox News, fostering a Republican fan base that was mesmerized by Bukele's tight grip on El Salvador. Yet, perhaps Bukele's most repressive and undemocratic policies are precisely why he is popular with his constituents and maintains stellar approval ratings. Through his hardline crackdown on gangs, Bukele managed to achieve security in El Salvador, but he did so at the expense of civil and human rights. Not too long ago, El Salvador was often referred to as the murder capital of the world by mainstream media due, in large part, to brutal gang violence plaguing the country. For decades, groups like MS-13 and their rival Barrio 18 terrorized neighborhoods, killing countless citizens and forcing thousands of people to flee the Central American country. On March 26, 2022, just a couple of years into Bukele's presidency, over 60 people were killed in the country of 6.3 million, making it the deadliest day on record since the end of El Salvador's civil war in 1992. The following day, Bukele declared a state of emergency and unleashed a set of policies that raised serious concerns in the international community. Bukele extended his special powers, deployed the military to the streets, arbitrarily rounded up and arrested thousands of men. Having a tattoo or being related to a gang member was good enough reason for targeting. and detained them in inhumane conditions in overcrowded jails. Shortly after Bukele began his massive crackdown, approximately 100,000 people were incarcerated,
Jesus.
up to 2% of El Salvador's entire population. By December 2022, Human Rights Watch found widespread human rights violations had taken place during Bukele's mass arrests, including arbitrary detentions, torture of detainees, deaths in custody, and lack of due process. And by 2023, Bukele was tweeting videos of thousands of barefoot, tattooed men in white boxers and shackles as they were being transferred to his newly constructed mega prison. He was proudly and unapologetically showing off his captives to the world. The footage reminded me, Ramos, of the gruesome images of detainees being held in Abu Ghraib. Images that would end up becoming proof of the United States government's human rights abuses. More than anything, Bukele and his show of force was reminiscent of a typical Latin American caudillo. For everything new Bukele represented, he was also the latest personification of the long lineage of autocratic leaders who have governed in the continent for centuries. The word caudillo means Spanish or Latin American military dictator, and specifically refers to the type of leaders that emerged from Latin America's wars of independence against Spanish colonizers in the early 19th century. As colonial powers were challenged across the Americas, a number of social uprisings were led by strong, charismatic men who inspired masses of people to join revolutions and reclaim their independence from Spain. Unquote. So,
Well, that seems familiar.
yeah, a little
Though,
bit.
I will say just one thing. That while it is very contemporarily familiar, this is a headline from an article in the New York Times from August 20th, 1934.
Okay.
Hitler endorsed by 9-1 in poll on his dictatorship. And I will say one thing about Bukele. None of the information that I've seen about his popularity was gathered outside of his administration. And I know from population statistics that 90% is a very suspicious number.
It is a very suspicious number, for sure.
Because it's a number that seems like basically everybody, but accounts for the fact that if you actually meet somebody in person who doesn't agree, that you can account for that in your mind.
That is true.
Bukele is, I think, a very, very well-informed, very probably intelligent dictator. And I think he knows that part of what is maintaining his power is the perception that he is popular.
Yeah.
And I also think that there is probably a very specific pattern used to arrest those 100,000 people, and I don't imagine that it was random.
Elaborate.
Who were the first people that Hitler arrested? Not Jews, not Roma, not gays, not even trans people, but his political enemies. And while I'm not going to make any claims about Bukele's connection to MS-13,
Right.
Information about those potential connections does exist. And it is notable that only one of those two gangs is still really meaningfully active in El Salvador. And it's not the one that he happens to be associated with.
Interesting.
So, I'm not saying that he's a paper tiger, because he's clearly a real tiger for anybody in his country. But he, like almost every dictator that claims to be stupid popular, is almost certainly manipulating that information. Kim Jong-un is unbelievably popular, but there's a reason for that.
Right.
The Ayatollah in Iran is very popular, but there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
And I imagine that Bukele saw those systems and thought, man, that looks tasty. I'll bet I could do that. And he was right.
He was right.
Use the military to sweep up your political rivals,
Yeah.
and the rest will come.
And I will not say that what he is right now is perpetual. Far from it. it can't be. It's impossible to be. You can't run a police state for that long without some rather serious consequences. So there's that. That being said, it's his rise to power that concerns me.
Yep. And honestly, one can do an awful lot of damage with a pretty short reign. I believe every Holocaust fatality happened in a window of, 18 to 24 months?
Give or take, yeah. And the people put him there because they genuinely believed that he was going to help them, or if not help them, hurt the ones who were hurting them.
I wonder who else in modern political theory could have been thinking like that.
Who could have?
I don't know. Maybe just one or two or 1,500 strong men idiots.
Yeah, but also think about what Bukele has done so far. And think about what this administration is doing now.
Yes. I mean, clearly this administration finds his audaciousness inspiring.
Yeah, because the guy is unapologetic. The guy is proud.
Yes, and he is potentially one of the most social media savvy leaders that we have.
Oh, he's a
in the world.
charismatic motherfucker.
Yeah, he's great at Twitter.
He's so good at this. It's infuriating how good he is at
Yes.
this.
Almost exasperating.
I gotcha!
And now for the section we like to call our denouement. So, first question, who wrote this book?
So this is Paola Ramos, who previously wrote Finding Latinx, In Search of the Voices Redefining Latino Identity. She is a contributor for Telemundo News and MSNBC, and a former correspondent for Vice News. Before being a journalist, she was the deputy director of Hispanic media for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and a political appointee during the Obama administration, and she served in President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign.
Second question, why was this book written?
This is to answer the question of what would make someone, be they an individual or a group, vote against what is ultimately more beneficial for them, and explain how Donald Trump and others who share his views receive support from groups that you'd think wouldn't even begin to consider supporting him. This is more narrowly for the folks who are trying to understand the seeming hypocrisy of Hispanic voting blocs voting against their self-interest, especially when the people they are voting for espouse and enact white nationalist agendas that would ultimately harm these voters. This is for the people who don't accept overly simplistic explanations and want to delve into the nuances of the Hispanic community, understanding the mindset, history, and context behind actions that, at first glance, appear self-defeating.
And our last question, should you read this book?
Absolutely. This, to me, isn't just a deep dive and a fair look at a complex and uncomfortable topic, though it primarily is. But it also allows us to start looking at other, seemingly unintuitive actions and mindsets, such as the larger swath of the population that consistently votes against their apparent interests for issues that, frankly, resonate more deeply with them. And maybe, just maybe, we can take some lessons from this book on how to reach them and get them out of this counterintuitive mindset that they are in. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Perpetually Exasperated. If today's conversation got you thinking a little bit deeper and a little more exasperated about everything, we want to hear from you. Give us a like, leave a review, share the show. Please send your feedback, thoughts, or questions you'd like us to answer in your comments.
Next time, we'll be reading and talking about Overruled, The Human Toll of Too Much Law by Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch and Janie Nitze, a book that, per HarperCollins, says, America has always been a nation of laws, but today, our laws have grown so vast and reach so deeply into our lives that it's worth asking, In our reverence for law, have we gone too far?
Until then, be critical, be skeptical, and remember, it's okay to be exasperated and to think outside the binary political spectrum presented to us. Stay safe, friends.